The air in Brackwater Cove always felt heavy before a storm. But that morning it was almost suffocating. The Gulf was flat and gray, a strange kind of quiet that made the seagulls sound louder than usual. I had just finished stacking the last of my lesson plans into a waterproof tote when Cassian came barreling through the front door. His hair damp with sweat even though it wasn't hot yet. "We're leaving now," he said, not even looking at me as he yanked open the hall closet and started pulling down bags. Cassian had lived through every hurricane this coast had thrown at us. And never once had he been this jumpy. "We've got at least a day before it makes landfall," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But he shook his head hard, tossing a windbreaker and mismatched sneakers into a duffel like he was packing in the dark. "No, Elara. We go now or we're trapped." Something about the way he said my name made my stomach twist. Neighbors were still outside, hammering plywood over windows, waving to each other like they had every storm season. Nash Kincaid, from across the street, raised a hand when he saw Cassian loading the car. But Cassian didn't wave back. Instead, he motioned for me to hurry, his eyes darting to the darkening horizon. I thought about calling Celine, my cousin up in Calder Springs, to tell her we might come stay. But when I mentioned it, Cassian snapped, "No, we're not going there." He said it like it was already decided, like my voice in this didn't matter. The first rain hit the windshield just as we pulled onto State Road 319. It was the thin, needling kind of rain that made the sky look like static. Cassian drove faster than I liked, his hands locked tight on the wheel. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't even glance at me. Just kept checking his watch like we were late for something. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, but all he said was, "Somewhere safe." That was it. No explanation, no plan. After nearly 2 hours of winding through side roads and stretches of pine forest, he slowed the car and turned onto a cracked driveway I didn't recognize. The rain had gotten heavier now, the sky swollen and bruised. A small house sat at the end, its beige siding stained from years of storms. Before I could ask whose place this was, the front door opened. A woman stepped out, her dark hair pulled into a messy knot, wearing a faded scrub top like she'd just gotten off a shift. 2 children bolted past her, a boy and a girl, maybe 7 and 5. "Daddy!" they shouted, their voices cutting clean through the sound of the rain. My brain didn't process it at first. I turned to look at Cassian, expecting him to laugh, to wave them off, to tell me they'd made a mistake. But he didn't. He got out of the car, ran to them, and dropped to his knees in the mud, pulling them into his arms with a desperate kind of relief I had never seen on his face. The woman's eyes met mine over their heads. There was no shock there, no guilt even, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who knew this moment would come. My chest felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out of it. Cassian kissed the top of the girl's head, said something I couldn't hear, and then looked back at me like he was bracing for impact. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose siding on the house. Inside my head, another kind of storm was forming. One that had nothing to do with the hurricane bearing down on Brackwater Cove. I didn't remember opening the car door, but suddenly I was standing in the downpour. Rain soaking my hair, my clothes clinging to me. Cassian was still crouched with the kids, his hands gripping their small shoulders like he was afraid they might vanish if he let go. "Cassian," I said, my voice cracking, but he didn't answer. The woman, Maribel, I would later learn, stepped forward, her bare feet splashing through the puddles on the porch. You should both come inside. The wind's getting worse, she said, not looking directly at me. It wasn't an invitation, it was a directive. Spoken with the quiet authority of someone who'd done this before. I followed them in, every muscle tight, my mind swinging between disbelief and a kind of cold, sharp awareness. The house smelled faintly of bleach and boiled rice. A single lamp cast a yellow glow over the living room, which was small but neatly kept. Toys were stacked in bins against the wall, and a stack of children's drawings was pinned to the fridge. In the corner, a laundry basket overflowed with tiny socks and t-shirts. Cassian closed the door behind us, locking it like we were settling in for the night. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low but cutting. He opened his mouth, but Maribel spoke first. "It's safer here than the shelter," she said. "You can wait out the storm." I stared at her, at the way she moved easily in this space. At the way the boy leaned against her leg and the girl curled into her lap as she sat down. These weren't moments you could fake. Cassian finally looked at me, his eyes dark, rainwater still dripping from his hair. "Elara, I was going to tell you," he began, but I laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. "When? Between the wind gusts? Or after you kissed them good night?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Outside, the wind howled against the siding, rattling the loose porch rail. A branch slammed into the window, and both children flinched. Without thinking, Cassian put an arm around them. I noticed the way their bodies fit against him like they had done it 1,000 times. The boy, Dorian, I'd later hear her call him, looked at me with wide, curious eyes. "Is she staying too?" he asked, and the question landed heavier than the storm itself. Maribel's hand froze in the little girl's hair, and she looked at Cassian, waiting for his answer. He hesitated just a second too long before saying, "Yes. We're all going to be safe here." That we cut through me. I sat on the edge of a worn couch, my wet clothes making a dark stain on the fabric. My phone was in my pocket, but when I checked, there was no signal. Even if I could call Celine, what would I say? That I'd just discovered my husband had a second family. And we were all riding out a hurricane together under the same leaking roof? The absurdity of it made me feel dizzy. As the storm intensified, the power flickered and went out, plunging the room into a dim, shifting light from the battery lantern on the table. Cassian moved around the house like he knew it, finding blankets in the hall closet, checking the flashlight drawer without needing to be told where it was. That's when I knew. This wasn't some hidden fling, some one-time mistake. He had been here, lived here, enough to know where the spare batteries were. Maribel tried to make small talk, asking if I wanted tea, but her voice was strained. I wondered how long she had known about me. If she had imagined this moment as much as I had dreaded whatever secret Cassian might someday confess. Dorian and Isla sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing shapes in a coloring book, their giggles briefly breaking through the roar of the wind. Cassian sat with them, his hand resting lightly on Isla's back. He didn't look at me once. In that moment, I realized the hurricane outside might pass in a day. But the one inside this house was going to leave a permanent mark. And there was no evacuation route for this. The wind had settled into a constant, low roar. Like the ocean itself was pressing against the walls. The lantern on the table cast long, shifting shadows across the room, making the small space feel even smaller. Cassian busied himself with the kids, reading from a picture book in a voice I hadn't heard in years, soft, animated, completely focused on them. I sat frozen on the couch, watching his every movement, each gesture cutting deeper. Maribel disappeared into the kitchen, the sound of mugs clinking faint under the storm. I stood up slowly, my body moving before my mind caught up. The hallway was narrow, the walls lined with framed photos. My eyes landed on one immediately, Cassian, standing barefoot on a beach, the sun catching his hair just right. Isla sat on his shoulders, laughing, her little hands gripping his forehead. Dorian was at his side, holding his hand. Maribel stood next to him, smiling in a way I hadn't in years. There was no mistaking it, they looked like a family. His other family. I moved further down the hall, my fingers brushing over the edges of other frames. Birthdays, school plays, a Christmas morning with Cassian in flannel pajama pants I'd never seen before. My breath was shallow, my heart thudding so loud I thought they might hear it over the storm. In the last frame, I saw something that made my chest tighten, Cassian and Dorian wearing matching fishing hats, the kind he and I used to wear on our early trips before marriage had dulled the adventure. He had passed those moments, those traditions, to a son I didn't know he had. A low creak from the floor made me turn. Maribel was standing at the end of the hall, holding 2 steaming mugs. Her expression was unreadable. "You shouldn't be walking around in the dark," she said evenly. I wanted to throw the photo frames at her, to demand every detail. But my voice came out quieter than I expected. "How long?" She hesitated, then stepped closer. 7 years. The words hit me like the wind slamming against the shutters. 7 years, longer than Isla's life. Meaning this had started when Cassian and I were still building ours. I took one of the mugs, my hands trembling from more than just the chill. "Did you know about me?" I asked. Her eyes flicked away. "Not at first. But eventually, yes." The casual way she said it made me feel both furious and hollow. I wanted her to be defensive, to fight me, to give me something I could latch onto. But she just looked tired. I went back to the living room, setting the mug down untouched. Cassian looked up at me briefly before returning to the kids' drawings. I realized then that he wasn't going to explain unless I forced him to. So I did. "You've been living 2 lives," I said, my voice louder now, cutting into the quiet. The kids paused, looking between us. Cassian's jaw flexed, his gaze steady but cold. "I was making sure they were taken care of," he said. "During the storm," I shot back, "or for the last damn decade." He stood, the lantern light catching the hard lines of his face. "This isn't the time, Elara." That made me laugh bitterly. "When exactly is the time, Cassian? After we all drowned together?" The silence that followed was broken only by the rattle of the front door in its frame. I couldn't stand still any longer. My hands itched for answers, so I went to the small desk tucked against the wall. In the top drawer, under a stack of unpaid utility bills, I found an envelope with handwriting I recognized, mine. It was a birthday card I had given him 2 years ago, the one I thought he'd lost. It had been here, in this house. Underneath it were receipts from grocery stores in Windmere Landing. Dates that lined up perfectly with the nights he'd told me he was working late. A deep rumble of thunder rolled through the floorboards. But it couldn't drown out the pounding in my ears. This wasn't just infidelity, it was logistics, schedules. An entire operation to keep 2 lives running side by side. He had rehearsed this for years, and the hurricane had simply pulled the curtain back. When I looked up, Cassian was watching me from across the room, his eyes unreadable. For the first time that night, I wasn't sure which storm was more dangerous, the one clawing at the walls or the one standing in front of me. The wind screamed like a living thing, hurling rain sideways against the windows until it sounded like handfuls of gravel pelting the glass. At some point, the front porch light blew out, leaving the house wrapped in shadow. We had dragged blankets and pillows into the living room. The kids curled up on one side while Cassian and I kept a gulf of silence between us. Every time the walls shuddered under the force of the wind, Isla would whimper, and Cassian would pull her close. Dorian, braver in his own way, sat with a flashlight under his chin telling her it was just the clouds talking. I envied his ability to believe in something that simple. The power had been gone for hours and the air inside was growing stale. Maribel was in the kitchen, rummaging for food that didn't need cooking. I sat against the far wall, my knees pulled up, the lantern at my feet throwing light on a small pile of gear stacked near the door, duffels, a cooler, a folded tarp. Something about the arrangement caught my attention. I recognized one of the duffels immediately. It was identical to the one in our garage back in Brackwater Cove. Same worn canvas, same stitched initials on the side, CW. I stood, drawn to it, and unzipped it halfway. Inside were neatly packed clothes, a pair of my sneakers, and a raincoat I hadn't seen in months. Before I could question why my things were here, I noticed a second bag underneath. Smaller but organized with military precision. 2 sets of children's clothes, small rain boots, snack packs, a deck of cards. On top of it all was a printed evacuation route with 2 addresses circled in red ink. One was our house, the other was this one. My stomach went cold. This wasn't improvised. This was a plan. I slid the paper back into place just as Cassian appeared in the doorway. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice too calm. I didn't answer. I held his gaze, letting the weight of what I'd just seen fill the space between us. He glanced at the bags, then stepped inside and zipped them shut. "It's called being prepared," he said, but there was no humor in it. "Prepared for what?" I shot back. "For a hurricane, or for the moment your 2 lives finally slam into each other." Maribel entered then, balancing a tray of crackers and peanut butter, her eyes flicking between us. The tension was thick enough to taste. "The roof over the back room is leaking," she said to Cassian, as if I weren't even there. "We'll need buckets." He nodded and disappeared toward the hall, leaving me alone with her. I could hear the wind battering the house harder now. The kind of gusts that made you think about structural failure. Maribel knelt by the kids, helping them spread peanut butter, but her voice was tight. I walked to the window, pressing my palm to the cold glass. Through the blur of rain, I could just make out the street, water pooling at the edges, creeping higher with every minute. The reality settled in. We might not be able to leave until morning, maybe longer. That meant sitting here, breathing the same air, pretending this was just about survival. But the map in that bag told a different story. He had planned for both households, with routes and supplies ready. As if managing 2 sets of lives was as routine as checking the weather. The next loud crack came from above us, followed by a rush of cold air and the sound of water dripping fast. Cassian called out for help, and we all moved toward the back. The ceiling in one corner had split, rain pouring in steady streams. He and I worked side by side without speaking, dragging furniture away and setting up buckets. Our hands brushed once, and I jerked mine back like the touch burned. When the immediate crisis passed, we returned to the living room, soaked again. The kids were huddled together under a blanket, the flashlight between them casting odd shadows on the wall. Cassian crouched beside them, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Maribel sat across from me, her expression unreadable. I wanted to ask her if she knew about the map, if she understood that this wasn't just an accident of timing, but I bit the words back. The storm outside was too loud, too unstable. And I knew anything I said now would explode in the wrong way. Still, the knowledge gnawed at me, that even as the hurricane bore down on Brackwater Cove, Cassian had made sure both of his lives had an escape route. He had been ready for the storm, but not for the reckoning that was now unavoidable. And neither was I. By dawn, the storm had shifted from violent rage to relentless pounding. A steady drumbeat of rain that refused to let up. The house had survived the night, but the yard was a shallow lake. And the road beyond was a slow-moving river. The back room was uninhabitable now, the roof sagging dangerously in one corner. Cassian paced near the window, scanning the street between gusts. "Water's still rising," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Maribel was kneeling by the kids, stuffing small backpacks with clothes and snacks. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. We were leaving. "Shelter at Windmere Community Center," Cassian said, pulling on his rain jacket. "They've got cots and generators." His tone was clipped, all business, as if we were just another group of evacuees. The walk there was miserable. We were knee-deep in water before we even reached the corner. Rain slicing sideways into our faces. Dorian clung to Cassian's hand while Elara rode in Maribel's arms, her head tucked into her mother's shoulder. I walked behind them, each step feeling heavier, as though the water itself was trying to keep me here, force me to face everything before we moved forward. The shelter was chaos, rows of cots, the sharp smell of damp clothes, the low hum of generators fighting the noise of the storm outside. Volunteers handed out blankets and cups of coffee, their voices pitched above the din. Cassian spoke briefly to a man in a red vest, then led us toward a cluster of empty cots near the far wall. We settled in wordlessly, the kids already burrowing under their blankets. Maribel disappeared to find extra pillows. Cassian went to help unload supplies from a truck that had just pulled up. That's when I heard it. "Elara? Elara Whitmore?" The voice came from across the aisle. I turned to see a woman in her late 50s, her silver hair pulled into a tight braid, eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched on her face. "It is you," she said, stepping closer. "I'm Gloria Finch. I work at the Brackwater Marina." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "I've seen you with Cassian," she continued, lowering her voice. "Didn't know he had, well, another." Her eyes flicked toward where Cassian was unloading crates. The room seemed to narrow around me. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Gloria leaned in. "He's been coming to the marina for years, renting boats, sometimes for days. Always with that woman over there, Maribel, right? And the kids. Everyone just assumed she was his wife." Her words landed like stones in my chest. Years. Not a fling, not a secret trip here and there, but a whole life carried out in daylight where strangers knew more than I did. Maribel returned then, holding 2 pillows. Her expression tightening when she saw Gloria standing so close to me. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice carrying that brittle edge of someone who already suspects the answer. I smiled faintly, a mask that felt like paper against my face. "Just catching up with a neighbor," I said. When she walked away, Gloria leaned in again. Storms have a way of showing what's been there all along, she said. Then turned and melted into the crowd of evacuees. I sat there, the words replaying in my head, my hands curling into fists inside the blanket. The generator hummed steadily, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. But all I could hear was the thud of my own heartbeat. Cassian returned a few minutes later, shaking water from his jacket. He glanced at me, then at Maribel, then back again. He didn't ask what Gloria and I had talked about. But I could see in the tightness around his eyes that he wanted to. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, I lay down on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The map from the duffel burned into my mind. He had planned for this, not the hurricane, but the collision of worlds. He just hadn't planned for the witnesses. The shelter smelled of damp wool and instant coffee. The air heavy with the breathing of too many people packed into one space. Outside, the rain still pounded the roof. A steady percussion that made every conversation feel like it was happening underwater. I sat on the edge of my cot, elbows on my knees, watching Cassian across the aisle as he showed Dorian how to fold paper into crude boats from a stack of napkins. Isla was curled against Maribel, already drifting in and out of sleep. I'd been holding it in for hours, but the silence between us had become its own kind of storm. And I knew if I didn't speak now, I'd drown in it. Cassian, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through the background noise. He looked up, his eyes cautious. We need to talk, now. He hesitated, glancing at the kids, then nodded. Maribel's gaze followed him as he walked toward me, her body tensing like she was ready to intervene if this went wrong. We stepped just outside the main hall into a narrow corridor lit by a single buzzing bulb. The hum of the generator filled the space between us. How long? I asked, the words coming out steady even though my pulse was erratic. He ran a hand over his face. Elara, number. How long? I repeated. His shoulders slumped. Since before Isla was born. The truth was like ice water in my lungs. Even though I'd already guessed. So all those late shifts, the weekend trips to help your brother, I stopped. Swallowing hard. You weren't even trying to hide it from everyone. Just me. He shook his head quickly. That's not true. I never wanted you to find out like this. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Like this? In a hurricane shelter, surrounded by both your families? My voice rose before I could stop it, and a few people down the corridor glanced our way. I lowered it again, but the words still carried heat. You planned this, I said. The bags, the map, 2 addresses circled in red. You were ready to evacuate both of us without ever telling the other we existed. For a moment, he didn't deny it. Then he said quietly, I was trying to keep you both safe. Something in me snapped. You don't get to use safety as a shield for betrayal. The door to the hall creaked, and Maribel stepped into the corridor, her jaw tight. Stop, she said firmly. The kids can hear you. I turned to her, my anger sharpening. They should know what kind of man their father really is. Cassian stepped between us, his voice low but urgent. Enough. This isn't the place. I stared at him, realizing he wasn't worried about the kids hearing the truth, he was worried about losing control of the narrative. Maribel crossed her arms. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to share him? Her voice trembled, but not with fear. He told me you two were finished. That you were just coexisting until you both could move on. The words hit me in the gut. Coexisting? I turned to Cassian. That's what you told her? That I was just some roommate you were waiting to get rid of? His silence was answer enough. The corridor felt smaller with every breath. Cassian stood there, caught between us, his eyes darting like a man looking for an exit in a burning building. I realized he wasn't going to choose. Not here, not now. That choice would be another thing he tried to postpone until circumstances made it for him. But for the first time, I didn't feel powerless in that equation. I stepped back, my voice calm in a way that made both of them look at me differently. You've built 2 houses in a storm zone, Cassian. You think you can keep them both standing, but storms don't work like that. Eventually, one is going to wash away. And it might not be the one you expect. Without waiting for a response, I walked back into the main hall. Past rows of strangers huddled in their blankets. The smell of coffee and wet clothes filling my lungs. I didn't look back to see if either of them followed. For the first time since the hurricane began, I realized the evacuation might not be the only journey I was about to take. By the 3rd morning, the storm was gone. The air outside the shelter was still heavy, but the sky had cleared to a pale, washed-out blue. People were packing, folding donated blankets, shuffling toward the exits with that strange mix of relief and exhaustion that comes after surviving something bigger than yourself. Cassian was helping load supplies back into a truck, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was buying time. Maribel sat on a cot with Isla in her lap, Dorian leaning against her side. They looked almost peaceful in the morning light, as if the last 3 days had been nothing more than an inconvenience. I stood near the doorway, my bag slung over my shoulder, feeling a strange calm settle over me. A volunteer handed me a clipboard to sign out. And that's when I saw it, a handwritten note clipped to the top with my name on it. I opened it without thinking. Inside, in Gloria Finch's tidy script, were just a few lines. When he rented the boat last August, he wasn't with Maribel. He was with another woman. Blonde. 2 kids. Called him Daddy. My stomach lurched. I read it again, slower this time, but the words didn't change. Another woman. Another set of children. The hurricane hadn't just revealed one hidden family, it had exposed the edges of a third. I slipped the note into my pocket before anyone could see. Cassian came in, brushing water from his sleeves. Ready to head back? He asked, as if we were just returning from a weekend trip. I nodded once, my expression unreadable. He didn't notice the shift in my eyes, the way the decision was already forming in my mind. The walk back to Windmere Landing was quiet. The streets littered with branches and bits of torn siding. Our shoes left wet prints on the cracked pavement. When we reached Maribel's house, Cassian offered to drive me home to Brackwater Cove. But I shook my head. I'll find my own way. His brow furrowed, but he didn't push. Maybe he thought I needed space. Maybe he thought he still had time to smooth this over. Inside, I gathered my few things, the raincoat from his duffel, my phone charger, a pair of shoes that still smelled faintly of our real home. I moved slowly, taking in the photos on the wall one last time, not with jealousy now, but with clarity. This was just one chapter of his double, no, triple, life. And I wasn't going to spend another storm, literal or otherwise, waiting for my turn to be chosen. As I stepped out onto the porch, Maribel followed me. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. I met her eyes. "You should know something," I said quietly. "You're not the only one." Her face paled, her mouth opening as if to ask. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. Let her live with that seed the way I had lived with mine. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, shards of light spilling onto the flooded street. I walked toward the main road, the weight in my chest shifting into something lighter. Sharper. Resolve. Cassian called after me once, my name stretching across the quiet morning. But I didn't turn around. I kept walking until the sound of his voice was gone, replaced by the rhythmic squelch of my shoes on wet asphalt. When I reached the intersection, I pulled out my phone. The signal bars were back. I opened a rideshare app and typed in an address, not home, not Celine's, but the small motel in Calder Springs where I'd once stayed during a school conference. Neutral ground. A place to think, to plan. As the car pulled up, I looked back only once. The town behind me was still drying out, still piecing itself together after the storm. But I knew some damage couldn't be repaired. Some houses weren't worth rebuilding. And as the car turned onto the highway, leaving Windmere Landing behind, I realized I wasn't just evacuating anymore. I was leaving for good.